Welcome to the Lobster Talks podcast by Lobster Capital, where we celebrate the bold thinkers and innovators driving change in the startup world. I'm your host, Gabriel Jarrosson, and today I'm very excited and happy to be joined by Jake Stein, the co-founder and CEO of Combinator. And Jake, he's a multiple exited founder. You already have 2 exits under your belt. That's really amazing. So I'm very excited to have you on the show and chat with you today. How are you?
I'm really good. Yeah, I'm excited to speak with you too, Gabriel. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've got a lot to cover. So Combinator is basically trying to simplify and streamline the way startups manage contracts. We're going to talk about, how you got there and what you did before and the idea. But first, maybe for the rare who don't yet know you, please introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah. Very happy to be out here. Jake Stein, co-founder and CEO of Combinator. There's 2 parts to our business. The first is standardizing contracts themselves. So I'm assuming a lot of folks in the audience are familiar with the SAFE. So what the SAFE is done for early stage funding, where it's a standard contract that lots of people use. We've created analogous contracts for sales and everything around sales, NDAs, partnerships, SLAs, DPAs, and so on. And then the other side of our business is software for managing those standard agreements. And there's lots of fun stuff we can get into that is enabled by those standards, but that's what we do.
That's pretty awesome. And I remember when we first met, that's exactly how I got it. I'm guessing that's how you introduce the concept almost always is we're the SAFE for pretty much everything else. And the SAFE is a pretty powerful tool. I can tell you, I started investing in France more than a decade ago. And then I've been investing in the US for years. And that's one of the most impressive difference. That's one of the major differences. In France, every single contract is different when you're investing. And so you spend hours and weeks and months. Fundraising in France is like 6 months. And obviously in the US, it's a couple of weeks. In YC, it's a couple of days. And so the SAFE changed everything. And your idea, I guess, was, why is it only for the SAFE? And so I think to remember, maybe I read it on your website, that this is actually a difficulty that you had in your previous endeavors. You had that problem, and so you wanted to do that. Can you kind of walk us more through how you got to creating Combinator?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So before this, I was a co-founder of 2 other B2B software companies. One was called RJ Metrics. It was a business intelligence and data analytics company selling mostly to e-commerce businesses. That company was acquired by an e-commerce platform called Magento, which itself was then subsequently acquired by Adobe. And then my second business was called Stitch. It was data integration software. So plugging into lots of different systems, pulling all the data out, loading them into Snowflake or BigQuery or Redshift, things like that. And we ultimately sold that company to Talend, which is another, thank you. Another data integration company that more like enterprise focused. And really across both of those experiences, I was on the go-to-market side and had all kinds of frustrations and challenges connected with contracts with our customers. And a lot of this I think is familiar to any founder or person on the go-to-market side. They're slow to negotiate. It pushes back the timelines for closing deals, negotiating those contracts. It's expensive. It's also creates what I felt was like a needlessly adversarial situation at the beginning of a relationship. So if you think about when you first talk, if you're a vendor, you're talking to a customer and they want to work with you, it's theoretically like a really happy time. Like they recognize they have a problem. They believe in your solution. They're like, hey, let's be partners. Everybody is happy about that. And then you get in like a little mini fight about the contract. And sometimes it's not so mini. And it's some of that is, whose template are we going to use? Some of that is like the actual redlining process of emailing Word docs back and forth. It's amazing that in 2024, we still do this. And then eventually you get the deal over the finish line. And then you actually have to do all the stuff that you promised to do in the contract and make sure that your customer does the stuff that they promised to do. If you have, 2 customers or 5 customers or 10 customers, that's not that challenging. But if you're fortunate and you have 100 customers or 500 customers or 1,000 customers, at least our experience was all these PDFs across all these Dropbox folders. And we just didn't know if we were violating our contract. So we didn't know if our customers were fulfilling their obligations. And there's all kinds of systems and processes downstream from those contracts, other things that need to change. So I personally felt like I was banging my head against this for more than a decade. And that's really what, inspired Combinator to try to solve that problem in a bigger systematic way.
It's really interesting what you just said, because one listener might listen to this and be like, okay, it's just, open source documents, that's fine. What you're hinting at, but I remember that's what you're doing in your DNA, is you have the open source documents, but then you have software checking in real time that everything is actually going on as contracted. Is that correct?
That's right. And so if you think about the way contracts work in companies today, they are like modeled after what contracts used to be, which is pieces of paper. And so if you like have a contract and you get it signed through something like DocuSign, you're putting a picture of a signature on top of a picture of a piece of paper. And similarly, if you have your PDFs inside your Dropbox folders, you have PDFs that look like pictures of, pieces of paper. And that's fine. That's a huge improvement over actually having a file cabinet full of pieces of paper. But in our view, the right model for these contracts is actually they represent interfaces. And those are interfaces between software applications, they're interfaces between companies, they're interfaces between teams at the same company. And we have a better model for what that interface can be, and that's the API, the application programming interface. Because the billing system needs to know what are the terms of the contract, who owes whom what, on what schedule. And ideally, your uptime monitoring system needs to know, do these different customers have different SLAs? Does the support team need to know we promised a certain response time to these customers? The entitlement system that say, hey, these people get 20 seats, these people get the super duper integration package, whatever. All those different systems and teams depend on the information in the contract. And so ideally, we would enable them to use that information. So both in terms of the entering into the contract, the negotiation, what do you give, what do you hold out on, what do you propose to them? There's structured data inside the contract. And so that the standard itself makes that process more efficient, but then it's also the software for creating that contract, negotiating that contract, executing it, and then enabling all those other systems and downstream processes to leverage that data to get paid faster, to not violate the terms, to renew, all those things that the business needs to do that's related to it.
It's fascinating. I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, but wait a minute, a contract, there's an infinite number of possibilities for a contract, literally an infinite number. And so if you want to build software to enforce the contract, to make sure everything runs as contracted, potentially there's an infinite number of softwares to build, and you can't do that. You want to be a scalable company. How do you think about that? You just go for the most common usage, or?
Yeah, so the way we think about this is, first of all, you're absolutely right, that there are an infinite number of valid contracts, and there are plenty of contracts that are sort of self-contradictory. You can make a contract that's not technically valid, but you probably won't even notice till later. We think the right way to think about this is that for any given contract type, there's basically a schema. There's a set of variables that the overwhelming majority of these particular contract type for this particular use case has a discrete number of things that change. And that's very different for different contracts. So the NDA only has 3 or 4 variables. It's how long it is, what's the government law, what happens if we sue each other. For a sales contract, there's a whole bunch of additional variables. There's what are the total fees? What is the schedule of the fees? Do I have to pay you, or do I just charge your credit card? What are the risk management things with the liability cap, the indemnity, and all those things? And there's different variables. It's a partnership. What am I promising to do? What are you promising to do? But the overall majority of it, again, we're focused on B2B software companies. For those companies, the vast majority of sales contracts have those different variables, and the variables can be tuned very differently. Like if you're selling payment processing software and your friend is selling word processing software, those are very different risks. You might have very different, liability terms, but you still both have a liability cap. Or you explicitly say, okay, there is no liability cap in this one, but it's $1 million in that one, and it's $50,000 in that one. So we approach it by trying to basically enumerate those variables. And again, this is not me doing it. We have a committee of 45 attorneys from all kinds of great companies and backgrounds, some big law firms like Goodman Proctor, some big tech companies like Salesforce and Confluent and Figma, and some smaller tech companies as well, like in-house and boutique firms. But all these different attorneys with these different backgrounds, they've seen hundreds of these different things on both sides, vendor and customer, and they sort of come up with what are the things that are truly standard, what are the variables that get tuned, and then there's always an escape hatch. You can append things to your contract. You can say, okay, this is the standard common paper cloud service agreement, but we have this one unique thing, which is we sell to Australian banks. And we always have to give a promise that we are going to comply with Australian banking law. So there's a very explicit place where you can, add and a way you can add things on. So you have that schema, and you could have an infinite number of values in the database. In a particular table, there's a certain set of data types, and those data types have a range of values. You might have a variant column, but you always know where that variant is. And that makes it a lot easier rather than just saying, okay, any information can be anywhere at any format in any sequence.
Yeah. And again, I think if we go back to the safe analogy, I was saying there's an infinite number of different contracts, but actually what you just said, which I think is good to remember, is you're going with B2B SaaS, you're going with certain types of contracts. And in a safe, we've both done a lot of safes. Probably I've done a little bit more than you, but you still have done your fair share. It's always the same three things, like the name of the company, name of the investor, amount invested, cap, and that's it. Like, it's so simple. And so same thing for an NDA. It's like duration, names, whatever, maybe geography or something. So just with those standard, like you have 5 or 10, there's already so much that you cover. So maybe you just don't need. I think it's also interesting to, I don't know if you've done that, to learn how to say no as a starter. Be like, hey, we don't handle that kind of thing. This is the 5 or 10 things we do. That's 80% of the market or something. And the rest we don't handle for now. Is this how you approach it? Are you planning on kind of covering 100% of the use cases, or just focus on the top ones?
Yeah, so we are definitely taking like a more narrow and deep approach. And thinking like DocuSign, which is, obviously very successful and they're a big company. They have a super horizontal tool. It's take any contract, put a signature on that contract. They do some other stuff now, but that's their main thing. And that contract, it doesn't matter if it's a mortgage. It doesn't matter if it's an employment agreement or a sales contract or, an M&A deal. It's just completely horizontal, and it doesn't really matter. Our philosophy is we think we can deliver a lot of additional value and unlock all kinds of things for both sides of the deal by going narrower and deeper. And, we started on day one with just NDAs. We've since, added, 10 other agreement types, but they're all like in the universe around B2B software. We think we have more work to do. We cover a lot of B2B software now, but again, it's B2B software commercial deals. So if you're negotiating a lease with your landlord, common paper is not really going to be very helpful. Like, I would say, don't come to common paper. Similarly, if you're a movie producer and you're trying to negotiate a deal with your big star, I would say common paper is not really the tool for you, but we can do so much more for the people within our reach, and that will expand over time.
And maybe someday you could have common paper movie industry, common paper real estate. Who knows?
Yeah, absolutely. I have had some very preliminary conversations with folks in construction and manufacturing and other fields. And a lot of the problems rhyme very much. And one thing I'll point out is that, the safe and common paper are not the only two standardization efforts in the world. Like the house that I'm in, I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Every house in Pennsylvania, basically, that's bought and sold is on a standard contract. And when I bought this house, there were, I don't know, maybe 10 variables. It's, what's the price? What's the escrow period? How long do I have to inspect it? Things like that. But, and that contract is the same contract that my neighbor used and their neighbor and everybody on my block and on every other block around here. And so there's these other examples where standard contracts have taken hold, and it really has, where it does happen, it's tremendously valuable for everybody involved, but it's only pockets throughout the economy.
But I'm thinking, many investors, including myself, look at the size of the market, what we call the TAM, total addressable market. And in your case, there's literally no limit at all. Because contracts being signed in the world, like you said, like real estate, movies, like there's an infinite almost number of contracts being signed. When you're renting a car for the day, you're signing a contract. It's like, it's never ending. So in terms of TAM, for sure, you got to be one of the biggest probably ever.
Yeah. There are no exaggeration, trillions of dollars going through contracts every year. And I don't think we'll have 100% of that in the next 5 years. But yeah, I do not worry much about the ability, if we're successful, to build a big business. We made a lot of progress, but we're on very, very early days in this journey.
And so I want to talk about the progress. I want you to share where you are with the journey and how well it's going. Before that, I had another question completely opposite. What's a very early challenge that you faced when you started this? Of course, right now it seems to be smooth selling and going really well. Congrats for that. But what's an early challenge that you faced that you didn't anticipate, and how did you overcome it?
Yeah. So one of the things that I did for Common Paper, which was actually very different than my other companies, is that I fundraised first. So with the prior two businesses, we built a product, we started selling it, and then, later after we had some traction, we then raised money. And, we had the benefit of having some exits before, investors who I'd worked with before. So we were able to raise money, and we were able to have, a successful fundraise pretty early on. And one big mistake I made that I didn't really think about this before is that I used the same pitch that I had successfully used on investors for early customers. And that was a complete failure because what investors, the story that I was telling them, which is a story I believe very much in, and I think is true, is, look at the network effect here. This is a thing where the more people who use it, the more valuable it is. And once this flywheel gets going, it feeds on itself and it's valuable for everybody and we'll have all kinds of capture and there's a huge TAM and all that stuff, which is, a good pitch for an investor. And then so honestly, for several months of the early days of me pitching the product to potential customers, I gave them basically this own pitch of look at this network effect. Look at how we go.
You don't care, right?
And, customers are like, that's so great. I'm so excited about this. I can't wait to use it once that network effect is live. Please let me know eventually when that happens. And so that is a terrible pitch for customer version 1. They were very nice. And I think they did believe in their vision, but I gave them no reason why they should use it today. And so it's obvious in hindsight, but that sort of mistake was kind of pervasive both in our positioning as well as, we needed to change some of the things about how we were building the product, how we were talking about the product, how we were selling it, the go-to-market model. And we needed to focus much more on the day one single player value. We see elements of the multi-party value already, but even today, when people go from not using us to trying us out to becoming embedded, they care much more about what does this do for me today? And then, I want to hear about the vision. That's great, but I'm only making a buying decision based on what it's going to do for me.
That's awesome. I love this. It's a great lesson for anyone doing sales. It's called WeFM, what's in it for me. Every customer needs to know what's in it for them. And if there's nothing for them, then they're not going to act. So never forget WeFM, what's in it for me. And that's what every potential buyer is asking themselves. And so a chance for you to promote Common Paper now. What's the new pitch? People listening to us, what's in it for them as a solo player before all those network effects kick in?
Yeah. So engaging with these things a lot. And so I'll maybe highlight two things. One is that even before, if you look, multiple years ago, before if you were literally the first person to start using Common Paper, even at that point, we can help you close deals faster. Because part of the original pitch was once people have seen this agreement multiple times, their review of it on the third time or the fourth time would be so much faster. And that is true. It is dramatically faster then. But even if your counterparty has never seen it, if you're making fundamentally a different pitch, that pitch will be better received. So traditionally, companies say, here, use my contract. And their counterparty might say, no, use my contract template. And there might be, an arm wrestling match to see who has the most leverage. And each side is trying to get something that the other side kind of knows, even before they read it, it's probably much more favorable to you than it is to me. So even on day one, when our users could point to our website and say, hey, we've adopted this standard contract that's free and open source and developed by these great attorneys. We're using that. It's not biased towards you. It's not biased towards me. It's sort of neutral and based on standards. That pitch is more successful, even if the counterparty has never seen it. And that now that, thousands of companies have seen it and signed these agreements, that pitch is only more effective, but that is definitely like a day one value prop, regardless of what your counterparty has seen before. The other thing that I'll mention is that this idea of turning the contract into API, everything is structured data. What almost all of our users do after they sign, for example, a sales contract with their customer, is they want to bill their customer. They want to get paid. And traditionally, the process for most companies is you sign a contract and then you use something else for billing. Maybe it's Stripe, maybe it's Zora, whatever. And then you have the PDF of the contract on the left-hand side of your screen, and you have the Stripe interface on the right-hand side of your screen, and you say, okay, it's whatever, it's $10,000. They do that, and you're plugging all this manually into the billing software interface. And honestly, don't always do that immediately. You might wait a week, you might wait a month. At that point, you're trying to figure out who's the right contact for billing. You send it to that person, they say, oh, I don't handle this. And it takes longer and longer to get paid, and there's manual error. And it's at most small companies, they don't have someone whose full-time job this is. So since everything in our system is structured data, we programmatically and automatically, the instant that the customer signs the contract, we can hit the Stripe API and tell Stripe about all the terms of this contract, generate the subscription, generate the invoices, and immediately present our customer's customer with a thing that says, hey, you just signed. The next step is billing. Can you confirm you're the right person, or do you want to assign this to someone else on your team? And then whichever way they go, we then give them the invoice, give them the payment page, and people get paid much, much faster. And it's the kind of thing that you could theoretically build it for yourself, but it would be specific to your custom contract. And since we're using a standard contract, we build it once and it works for all the companies that use our system.
That's really cool. I love that. Your pitch is super compelling. I'm not surprised you have such success. You've mentioned several things that I wanted to, there were parts of the questions that I wanted to ask you anyway. So I'll jump to this. Your contracts are open source. So they're available on your website. So one of my questions was going to be, how do you monetize? It's pretty obvious now that you're selling the software with the payment, et cetera, et cetera. But the number one question I wanted to ask you was, do you consider yourself an open source company?
I think we are definitely an open source company, or at least inspired heavily by open source. Like, what's open source is not our software, it is the contracts. And we there's some differences from someone like, Mongo or Confluent or something like that, where like the license that our open source released under is, Creative Commons, which is the appropriate license for like a document rather than software. But the model is very much the same. And it's, the strategy of create these open source things that are free, that can be used for any purpose by anybody. And then part of the value to us is that that's lead gen for the thing that we charge money for. So yes, I would say that we're an open source company.
Okay, that's awesome. And so on the business model, you sell a subscription, I'm guessing. Do you also take a percentage of the payments?
Yes. So you're right that the software, there's a free tier. And then at higher volumes, or if you need some of the advanced features, you pay a subscription fee for the software. And then, yes, part of the deal is, we're sending a bunch of business to Stripe. And so we get, a referral fee basically for it.
And so you hinted a couple of times that it's going really, really well. What can you share with us? I mean, it's exciting. Tell us more.
Yeah. So we're really grateful for it. So tens of thousands of people have like downloaded the open source contracts, which is awesome and very exciting. One of the things that's by design in our system is that we actually don't know about most of the usage of the contracts, because most of those people download the contract and it's a PDF or a Word doc, and then you can use our software to send it, but you don't have to. So most of those people, we don't even know who they are. But we do have really good visibility into everybody who's using our software. So within the software, thousands of companies have reviewed and signed the contracts. And so some of that is sending to other side, some of that is receiving. But we've been really happy to see a lot of usage. And every once in a while, we'll have like just a conversation with someone. We say, oh, yes, we downloaded the agreement, we use it, and we signed it 1,000 times last month or something like that, like with all these different categories. Like, oh, wow, it's super exciting. But like, we know we don't have tracking of most of the usage, but thousands of companies have signed it within the software. And within that software, we have more than 100 paying customers for the software. So it's sort of you can think about it as a big funnel where lots of people are touching the agreements, using them. A subset of those people are using the software for proposing and signing them. And a subset of those are actually paying customers using us at scale.
That's awesome. Congratulations. Exciting. From 10 minutes ago, you made the quote unquote mistake, that's what you said, of raising early, or maybe too early, or at least before you had a product. And I believe you also fundraised quite heavily before going to YC. And so then you were accepted to YC. And as you might know, this show is specific to YC founders. Lobster Capital, my fund, is investing exclusively in YC. And so I always like to talk about YC and the value that it brings. A lot of people think that YC is probably only for fundraising. In your case, you had fundraised, heavily before. And so you didn't maybe need YC for that. So why did you choose to go to YC? Did they actually bring any other value apart from fundraising?
Yeah. And one thing I'll clarify, I realized I gave the wrong impression. I don't think for us, it was a mistake to fundraise on day one for Common Paper. The mistake was really in using the fundraising pitch on, early customers. I think
yeah, maybe we can talk about that. Why did you raise so early, and why do you think it was a great idea then?
It's very different to like the Common Paper model. It requires a huge amount of upfront investment. So with regular B2B software, you need to build a product and you need to convince one customer to pay for it. But our whole business model is predicated around building the software around the open source agreements. And so we needed to start building the agreements first. And we needed attorneys' help to build those agreements. And so I am not an attorney. My co-founder is not an attorney. And so we, started with just entirely outsourced help. And then eventually one of our first hires was a full-time attorney who's with us to this day. And she's amazing. But I think it's partially our skill set. Like if all was required on day one was writing code, we could potentially do that and bootstrap our whole customers. But we needed a bunch of legal help before really the product could start to be sold. And so our strategy was to like kickstart that with all the attorney involvement. So that's really the reason why we decided to start, fundraise from day one. The other thing, candidly, is it was an option for me. And I'm not sure that it would have been an option for me with, company number one, because, we just didn't have the track record. Maybe we could have, I don't know. So going to the other piece of your question, YC, what was the value there? The reason we didn't do YC immediately, we only decided to do that later once we sort of refined our ICP, our ideal customer profile, where one of the things we learned after the first 6-9 months of building the software and talking to potential customers is that we refined our ICP to focus on earlier stage companies. So we have some later stage users and companies as well. But we decided that at least for the first phase of the company, we wanted to go really early. And so we thought, okay, what is the best way to embed ourselves in the early stage ecosystem? And YC, is head and shoulders above everyone else there. We also have like 2 amazing seed firms that met around Encore Capital and Bold Start. They were very helpful and they were super supportive of us doing this. Another reason we decided to do YC was that standard contracts, we're not the first ones to think that standard contracts are valuable, but there's actually very few examples of standard contracts becoming successful. And almost all of them are some sort of industry association. Like I mentioned, the Pennsylvania real estate, there's a Pennsylvania Association of Real Estate Brokers that create the contract that everybody uses here. There's, other standard agreements like the National Venture Capital Association actually has some standard agreements that have pretty good distribution. But again, all of those are created by industry associations. And so one of the very few examples of a standard contract that has traction without this industry association is YC with the safe. So I thought, oh my gosh, wouldn't it be valuable to have the people who've done this thing that we want to do, that no one else in the world can give us advice about this, except for, specifically Carolyn Levy, the original creator of the safe, and, the other attorneys at YC as well. So that was another big value we got out of it. So those were sort of the 2 big things. If we think, okay, we want to go in on early stage, what is the premier early stage firm? And then second, how can we get advice from the people who like created the safe? Those were the 2 biggest things. And we did, get a ton of value there. The other thing that I'll say is just the advice was just really helpful. Like the partners were amazing. And I think one thing that I didn't appreciate ahead of time was just being in this cohort of other really early stage companies where everybody's very ambitious, everybody's very friendly, everyone's really smart. And then just seeing their progress, week after week and thinking, gosh, they just closed this big deal or they just released this amazing feature. Why are we doing that? And just really motivating to help us, go faster. So yeah, it was amazing. One of the better decisions.
That's awesome. It's prompting a question in my head where there's a lot of people who say, and sometimes they say it in a way that it's a bad thing. And that's why I want to talk about it with you. I don't think it is. There's a lot of people saying, oh, YC is interesting only if you're a B2B tool and you're selling to other YC companies. And there's 6,000 now YC companies in total. And so do you think that's true? Or do you think there's value in YC, even if you're a B2C product maybe? And also, are most of your customers YC startups or not really?
So most of our customers are not YC startups. We do have a ton of YC startups. I think in the last batch, something like 80 founders, signed up and started using Common Paper.
Wow.
Which is great. We have way more customers and users who are not YC than we have YC users. Look, there definitely are advantages if you're a B2B company, because it's a community of a lot of other businesses. And, you have the benefit of the doubt when you're talking to them, when you're reaching out to them, when you want to learn from them, if you want to sell to them, whatever. There were a bunch of badass companies in our batch that were like, I think there were like 2 or 3 airplane companies. It was amazing. Like one was like making these like airplanes that could stay aloft for like multiple weeks with, electric batteries and solar panels. Amazing. There's like several different permutations. There's at least one space company. So there are a bunch of other companies. I am probably not the person to say, oh, this is what a founder of one of those companies should care about YC. So, I think they certainly know. I've forgotten more than I'll ever know about that. But the one thing that I will say, and this is something you mentioned before, is the fundraising advantage coming out of YC. It is really a remarkable situation to go through demo day, to like be in that batch model, and then just have like such a huge number of investors who are all, looking to invest in companies at your stage. I think that is valuable for any company that, cares about fundraising. If you're bootstrapped, obviously that's not as valuable of a thing. But my understanding is that if you're building hardware, or if you're building something, many of these other businesses, a hard tech company, like fundraising is really important. You need to raise a lot of money if you're like building Fusion or something. And so I think that aspect of YC is maybe even more valuable for those companies than it is for like a B2B SaaS company.
Fascinating. Moving on to a different topic, one of my questions was going to be, do you have any advice on fundraising? But you've mentioned, it's so easy for you to fundraise because you've sold 2 businesses. So I guess your advice is start by selling 2 businesses, then you can fundraise. And so I want to transform the question. Do you have any, you can give us advice on fundraising as well, but do you have any advice on selling your business?
Well, one thing I want to make sure I don't give the wrong impression on is that, we had a very successful seed round for Common Paper. I have had numerous fundraising attempts over my career that were nowhere near as successful, including several complete failures. So there are rounds that we tried to do in prior business where, after multiple months, my co-founder, the prior company was named Bob. Me and Bob were like, all right, well, I guess we just can't raise a Series C right now. So let's go back. Let's just try to make the business better. And that was very, frustrating and demoralizing. And, now Ben, my co-founder at the current company, we've only, really raised the seed round, and that was really successful. But I'm sure that we'll together have some frustrating experiences, in the future in Common Paper. So I don't want to give the impression that it's all easy for me and everything's great. The one thing that I found has been helpful for me in fundraising is the same kind of customer development you might do for sales and actual customers, I try to do for investors. So I'm trying to find out through a bunch of different channels, what are the investors who are the customers of the equity in my company? Like, what are they looking for? And you can find that out, some of that's in the YC handbook. You can find that out by talking to your existing investors. Like, I go to my seed investors for live advice around what Series A investors are looking for. But I also ask the questions when I talk to potential Series A investors, what is most scary about our model? What is most valuable about our model? Like, what are the things that if they were true, you would be flying to Philadelphia tomorrow, preempting my round with a term sheet? Sometimes I get a good answer to that, sometimes I don't. But just trying to basically the same way that before you have a product, you might talk to potential customers, ask them how they've bought other things, what features are most or least important. It's not a guarantee by any means, but I think trying to get that data so that we can tailor our pitch is very helpful for me. And then the last bit on selling the company, I think the most important thing is to have, if you're lucky enough to have anybody interested in acquiring your company, and lots of times, it's tough to get one, but there's such a huge difference in going from one interested party to 2. And that's like an easy thing to say, but it's so, so valuable if you can. And it's extremely difficult in the, if you find someone who's interested in acquiring your company, they are ready to go. They give you a term sheet. It's incredibly challenging to go from 0 to interested buyer, interested second bidder in the time that the first party needs you to move in. And so you can't wait. If you want to have a second bidder, your odds are dramatically decreased if you are not cultivating those relationships in the first place. And it would be a big mistake to spend all of your time or majority of your time or even 10% of your time cultivating potential acquirers. But if you can have some of those long-term relationships with the people who are your potential future acquirers, just so they know who you are, just so you've talked a couple times over the years, I found that to be very helpful, just because once someone came inbound and said, hey, would you be open to acquiring Stitch? And we were at a point where we were thinking about, yeah, potentially, I could call up 5 other people and say, hey, we talked over the years. I've always respected you. Totally okay if not, but I think this is going to happen. Do you have any interest? And that can really change the dynamic of the situation.
Wow, I love that so much. I sold 3 businesses in my past entrepreneurial life, and small exits, the 3 of them. I'm not trying to pretend that they were big, but the biggest one was actually exactly that situation where I had a bidding war of two people just, and the price went up, I believe 25%, which is like substantial. And so is this, I'm guessing the reason why you want to have several bidders is to basically be in a much stronger negotiating situation?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because that way, and you know, the even better situation, the by far the most important thing is to have a great business that you'd be fine not to sell. So you want to have, you know, really good other options besides taking that first offer. And one of those options can be, yes, I'm just going to continue to run my business and grow it, and that's great. And either I'm cash flow positive or I can raise money from investors. So really, you just want to create optionality. But yeah, the ideal situation is exactly what you described, where if you decide it is time to sell, you have multiple, and you know, 3 is better than 2, 4 is better than 3, but just the biggest difference is going from 1
to 2. And it's true, my very first exit, I had only one buyer, and I told him that I was super young. And so I told him I want to sell no matter what. And so they gave me a terrible offer, which I accepted, but it was terrible.
If you had no option.
Okay. You know, it's fascinating because it's all about leverage and it's all about optionality. But for me, it's really fascinating how often this is the case. It's not only about selling your startup. It's also the case for fundraising. Something you see YC startups do is apply pressure to investors by saying, hey, you know, we have other people interested. Do you want to be in or not? And it's the same for selling. It's probably the same in relationships like outside of work. There's a lot of things. I think it has to do with human psychology, but it's fascinating to me how often we find those concepts that always are so true.
I think that's really smart, and I completely agree. And you know, obviously, there's like differences in each of those situations, like where like you know you don't want to be saying to your future spouse like I'm gonna be with this other person unless you say yes to me right now. But like you're going to be better off if this is not your only option. If this is not, there's a saying. I wish I knew who said this. I think about this all the time. It's like the best way to get what you want is to deserve it. And I think that's a really, really nice idea. And then, you know, the way that you'll get it is because if you deserve it, there'll be lots of people or companies that want to be in relationship with you. That's either acquire your company or invest in your company or be your friend or be a partner or whatever. And so I think that's like a meta version of the business.
That's really cool. The best thing to get what you want is to deserve it. I love that. You don't even know this, but at the end of each show, I ask for a favorite quote. And so that's it. You just nailed it. And I love that. That's going to stay with me. Thank you very much for that. I wanted to also come back to something you said. I've been fundraising for my fund, and I've heard someone mention, I never used it, but I've heard someone mention a technique to fundraise, to talking to investors, and ask the question, what will it take for you to invest? And so it's kind of similar to what you said earlier when you're talking to investors and say, you know, in which world would you preempt my Series A and be happy about it? Yeah. And so you've, because I've never tried that, just asking point blank, like, what will it take? But it seems like you have. Do you recommend that? Does it sort of work?
Sometimes it does. It is very uneven. And you know, different people respond to it in different ways. And some people just don't really respond to it. And that's fine. You know, that's up to them. But, you know, some people, they talk about, oh, you know, for them, it's like really, it's not so much about revenue. It's about the explosion in the top of funnel. They want to see that, you know, however much is getting converted down, they figure that can be changed. You know, some other investors, they're really focused on revenue growth. And certain people, they're like, okay, I really believe the thing that's going to be very persuasive to me is the fact that you can attach other products to this core product. So I'm very interested to know that. So sometimes they give a really great answer. Sometimes they sort of talk in broad strokes about the Series A market, which is less valuable for me personally, candidly, because I'm trying to find out, you investor of one, me co-founder of a company of one, what is the investor company fit in this particular case? I've never gotten a response like, how dare you ask me that? Sometimes it's very illuminating. Sometimes it's not entirely. And what's actually nice is that with some investors, I've asked that question a couple of times and heard how their thought has evolved on it, and also helps me understand how do they think about my business and gives me some insight as like, what would it be like to work with this person? Because everybody has different values and priorities. And if they're giving an answer that I think is just wrong, well, maybe I have the opportunity to learn something, or maybe that just we're not aligned on this business and maybe we're not the right, long-term partners.
It's also teaching you about the person. I love that.
Absolutely.
I'm listening to you and I'm guessing it's better for a startup than for a fund, because with a startup, you can just go and build whatever they ask you or change whatever. For me, raising a fund, I think it's a very bad idea to change your fund and your idea based on one person. at the very beginning of a fund, you can kind of test your hypothesis and change, but very quickly you're set with your fund and you're not going to change it. Okay. The quote was my next question. We can skip that, but I love it. I'll repeat it, see if I remember it. The best way to get what you want is to deserve it.
That's right.
I love that.
I'm like tempted to look up right now who it's actually from, because I say it all the time and I don't even know that.
Yeah, I mean, the listeners can find out as well and Google it.
It's from Charlie Munger. No surprise. None of my best quotes are from Charlie Munger.
That's not too bad. Yeah. Now that I loved it already, now that it is from Charlie Munger, it's probably even better. What's is there, I don't know, a goal or something really ambitious or something you're really looking forward to for Common Paper that's coming in the near future, in the distant future?
Yeah, the thing that's coming up soon, we actually already released the first version of it, is, basically every other tool related to contracts has some AI features, and we've been building some additional ones. So we released like the first small example of that, but there's a whole roadmap of these things that I think the combination of standards and AI really unlocks a bunch of things that AI by itself does not. So there's a bunch of these permutations, both in like summarizing the contract for our user, helping their recipient understand the contract, and then also in those situations where our customer is dealing with someone who's they can't get to use the standards. They need to use their own. They need to make a bunch of changes, helping our user understand how that deviates from the standards. There's a bunch of things in that universe that I'm really excited about.
It is super exciting. I mean, we made it 45 minutes without talking about AI at all. I was really surprised, but you're right. I mean, contracts are, large amounts of data that can be summarized, and it's a perfect use case for AI. Okay. Thank you so much, Jake. For our listeners, where can they find you online and where can they find Common Paper?
Sure. So Common Paper is just commonpaper.com. They can find me on LinkedIn. My thing is LinkedIn/in/Jake Stein, and Twitter, I guess now X. My username is just Jake Stein.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for being here and sharing with me. I had a blast. And to our listeners, thank you for joining. Don't forget to subscribe for more conversations like this. And please don't forget to rate us and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time on the Lobster Talks, stay bold, stay curious, and remember, those big ideas start somewhere. Thank you, Jake.
Thank you.